How the 1938 hurricane devastated New England and changed America's climate future forever. On the morning of September 21st, 1938, the sun rose golden over Long Island. Children walked to school with lunch pails swinging at their sides. Fishermen hauled their boats into calm harbors, preparing for another quiet autumn day. In Providence, Rhode Island, shopkeepers unlocked their doors and swept the sidewalks clean. In Hartford, Connecticut, factory workers punched their time cards and took their places along assembly lines that hummed with the rhythm of American industry. No one looked at the sky with fear. No one packed emergency supplies or boarded up windows. No one said goodbye to the people they loved, as though it might be the last time. They had no reason to. The Weather Bureau had issued no warnings for New England. The radio stations played swing music and reported on European tensions, on Hitler's movements, on the price of wheat. A storm existed somewhere far out in the Atlantic, but it was heading toward Florida, they said. It would curve away from the coast as hurricanes always did. The cold waters of the north would weaken it. The jet stream would push it harmlessly out to sea. That was what the scientists believed. That was what the forecasters promised. That was what everyone in New England assumed as they went about their ordinary Wednesday routines, never suspecting that within hours, the most powerful storm in 3 centuries would erase entire communities from the map. By nightfall, 700 people would be gone. 63,000 homes would be destroyed. The face of New England would be changed forever. And the way America understood weather, prepared for disaster, and thought about the power of nature would never be the same again. This is the story of the great New England hurricane of 1938, the storm that came without warning, the catastrophe that no one predicted, and the tragedy that transformed a nation. The hurricane was born in early September, somewhere off the west coast of Africa. A cluster of thunderstorms gathered over the warm tropical waters, feeding on heat and moisture, spinning slowly into a circular pattern that meteorologists would later recognize as the signature of a developing cyclone. By September 10th, the system had organized into a tropical storm. By September 15th, it had intensified into a hurricane, its winds exceeding 75 miles per hour as it churned westward across the Atlantic. In 1938, there were no satellites orbiting the Earth, capturing images of cloud formations from space. There were no Hurricane Hunter aircraft flying into the eyes of storms to measure pressure and wind speed. There were no computer models calculating trajectories and probabilities. The science of meteorology relied on ship reports, scattered weather stations, and educated guesses based on historical patterns. The hurricane crossed through the Bahamas on September 19th, weakening slightly as it interacted with land. Ships in its path reported fierce winds and mountainous seas, but many of these reports arrived late or were lost entirely in the chaos of communication networks that connected the Caribbean to the mainland. At the Weather Bureau office in Washington, D.C., a young forecaster named Charles Pierce studied the available data with growing concern. The storm had not followed the expected track. Instead of curving northeast away from the coast, it appeared to be accelerating northward, directly toward the mid-Atlantic states. Pierce believed the hurricane would make landfall somewhere between New Jersey and New England within 48 hours. He wrote his analysis and submitted it to his superiors. They disagreed. The chief forecaster, a man with decades of experience, dismissed Pierce's concerns. Hurricanes did not strike New England with full force. The historical record showed that storms weakened dramatically as they moved over the cooler northern waters. The last major hurricane to devastate the region had occurred in 1815, more than a century earlier. The odds of such an event repeating were astronomical. Pierce's warning was overruled. No hurricane advisory was issued for the northeastern states. The Weather Bureau's official forecast for September 21st called for cloudy skies with rain, possibly heavy at times, nothing more. Charles Pierce would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life, not because he had failed, but because no one had listened. The morning of September 21st began with an eerie stillness along the New England coast. The air felt heavy, thick with humidity that seemed out of place for late September. Barometric pressure dropped steadily throughout the morning hours, though few people noticed or understood what it meant. Birds behaved strangely, flying inland in large flocks as though fleeing from something invisible. In West Hampton Beach, on the south shore of Long Island, families gathered at the oceanfront estates that lined the dunes. Summer was officially over, but many wealthy New Yorkers lingered in their beach houses, enjoying the last warm days before autumn arrived in earnest. Children built sandcastles near the waterline, Couples walked hand in hand along the shore. Servants prepared lunch in the grand kitchens of mansions that had stood for generations. At noon, the sky began to change. Clouds thickened and lowered, turning from white to grey to an ominous greenish-black that veterans of tropical weather would have recognized instantly. The wind picked up, first in gentle gusts, then in sustained blows that bent the beach grass flat against the sand. The ocean, which had been calm all morning, began to churn with waves that grew larger by the minute. By 2 o'clock, the first bands of the hurricane reached Long Island. Rain fell in horizontal sheets, driven by winds that had already exceeded 60 miles per hour and were climbing rapidly. The storm surge, pushed ahead of the hurricane's center like a wall of water, began to rise against the beaches. Within minutes, the Atlantic Ocean had crossed the dunes and was pouring into the streets of West Hampton Beach. The residents had no time to evacuate. There had been no warnings, no sirens, no urgent radio broadcasts telling them to flee. By the time they understood what was happening, escape was impossible. Roads flooded, cars stalled in rising water, telephone lines went down, cutting off communication with the outside world. In the oceanfront mansions, families scrambled to upper floors as seawater crashed through ground-level windows. Servants helped elderly homeowners climb staircases that shook with each impact of the waves. Children cried in terror as the world they knew dissolved into chaos. The surge rose to 20 feet in some locations. Entire houses lifted off their foundations and floated away, carrying their occupants into the churning sea. Other structures collapsed under the weight of the water, crushing everyone inside. Bodies would wash ashore for weeks afterward, many never identified. When the hurricane's eye passed over Long Island at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the winds stopped abruptly. Survivors emerged from hiding to find a landscape of devastation. Where beach communities had stood hours earlier, only foundations remained. Boats had been thrown a mile inland. Automobiles lay scattered like toys, and everywhere the bodies of the drowned. But the eye passed quickly, and the storm's second half arrived with even greater fury. The winds now blew from the opposite direction, and the storm surge that had flooded the South Shore drained back toward the ocean with tremendous force, dragging debris and survivors alike into the waves. On Long Island alone, the hurricane took 200 lives in less than 3 hours. But the storm was not finished. It was moving north at nearly 50 miles per hour, faster than any hurricane in recorded history, carrying its full strength directly into the heart of New England. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, if stories of human resilience and the power of nature move you, if you want to understand how ordinary people face extraordinary challenges. Then join this community. Subscribe now because you are already part of this story. The hurricane struck the Connecticut coastline at 4 in the afternoon. The city of New London, a historic seaport that had prospered since colonial times, found itself directly in the storm's path. Downtown streets flooded within minutes. The famous lighthouse at the harbor entrance was battered by waves that reached 40 feet in height. Ships in the harbor broke their moorings and crashed into one another, creating a tangled mass of wreckage that blocked the channel for months. In the working-class neighborhoods along the waterfront, families huddled in their homes as the wind tore roofs away and water rose toward the ceilings. Many residents were immigrants who had come to America seeking better lives, who had worked in the textile mills and shipyards that powered the local economy. They had survived poverty, prejudice, and the Great Depression. Now they faced a storm that cared nothing for their struggles or their dreams. Margaret Sullivan, a widow with 3 children, lived in a small wooden house near the railroad tracks. When the water reached her front porch, she gathered her children and climbed to the attic, pulling them through a narrow opening in the ceiling, just as the first floor filled completely. They spent 4 hours in that cramped space, listening to the house groan and shift beneath them, praying that the structure would hold. When the storm finally passed, Margaret emerged to find half her neighborhood gone. Houses that had sheltered families for decades had simply vanished. Bodies floated in the streets. The smell of salt and death hung heavy in the air. But Margaret and her children were alive, and in the days that followed, as rescue workers arrived and relief supplies poured in, she would become one of thousands of ordinary people who rebuilt their lives from nothing. She would work 2 jobs to support her family. She would refuse charity whenever possible, insisting on earning every dollar she received. She would live to see her children graduate from high school, attend college, and build families of their own. Years later, when asked about the hurricane, Margaret would say simply, "We survived because we had each other." That is all anyone needs. The storm's path carried it directly over Rhode Island, striking Providence with catastrophic force. The capital city, built around Narragansett Bay, experienced a storm surge that exceeded 14 feet. Downtown streets that normally saw streetcars and automobiles became rivers of debris-filled water. The famous Industrial Trust Tower, the tallest building in the city, swayed visibly in the wind but remained standing, a testament to modern engineering against nature's fury. But not all structures were so fortunate. Along the waterfront, warehouses collapsed, releasing their contents into the flood. Drums of oil and chemicals mixed with the seawater, creating a toxic soup that spread through the city streets. Fires broke out in several locations, adding smoke and flame to the chaos of wind and water. The railroad station, a grand Beaux-Arts building that served as the gateway to Providence, flooded to a depth of 8 feet. Passengers who had been waiting for delayed trains found themselves trapped on the upper levels, watching helplessly as the water rose. Railroad workers organized rescue efforts, ferrying stranded travelers to safety in improvised boats made from doors and wooden crates. In the Italian neighborhood of Federal Hill, residents climbed to rooftops as the floodwaters surrounded their homes. They called out to one another in the darkness, their voices barely audible above the wind. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades, who had shared meals and celebrated weddings and mourned losses together, now shared the terrifying uncertainty of survival. When dawn broke on September 22nd, the people of Providence looked out upon a transformed city. The flood had receded, but it had left behind a landscape of ruin. Automobiles lay overturned in intersections. Storefronts had been gutted by the surge. The bodies of victims lay in the mud, awaiting identification and burial. The death toll in Rhode Island exceeded 300. Property damage was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, an almost incomprehensible sum in Depression-era America. But the people of Providence did not surrender to despair. They began the work of recovery immediately, clearing debris, searching for survivors, and planning for the future. The hurricane continued northward through Massachusetts, weakening gradually as it moved over land, but still delivering punishing winds and flooding rains. Worcester, Springfield, and Boston all experienced significant damage. Trees that had stood for centuries fell across roads and power lines. Rivers overflowed their banks, flooding communities that had never experienced such devastation. In the Connecticut River Valley, the combination of hurricane rainfall and previous September storms created flooding that surpassed anything in living memory. The river rose more than 30 feet above normal levels, inundating towns and farms across a swath of territory 50 miles wide. Hartford, the state capital, watched in horror as the Connecticut River approached and then exceeded flood stage. The downtown district, home to some of the largest insurance companies in the world, found itself surrounded by water. The irony was not lost on observers that the city known for protecting Americans against disaster had been unable to protect itself. The hurricane finally dissipated over Canada late on September 21st, its energy exhausted after a rampage that had covered nearly 1,000 miles in less than 12 hours. Behind it lay a trail of destruction unlike anything New England had ever experienced. The statistics were staggering. Between 600 and 800 people had perished, though the exact number would never be determined. More than 63,000 homes had been destroyed or severely damaged. Nearly 9,000 businesses had been wiped out. 2 billion trees had been knocked down, many of them ancient hardwoods that had witnessed the founding of the nation. The economic impact was equally devastating. Total damage exceeded $400 million, equivalent to more than $7 billion in modern currency. In communities where the average family earned less than $2,000 per year, the loss of homes, possessions, and livelihoods represented a blow from which many would never fully recover. But the human cost could not be measured in numbers alone. Families had been torn apart. Children had lost parents. Parents had lost children. Communities that had stood for generations had been erased from the map. The psychological trauma would linger for decades, passed down through generations as stories of loss and survival. In the weeks following the disaster, relief efforts mobilized across the nation. The American Red Cross established emergency shelters in schools, churches, and public buildings. The Civilian Conservation Corps, one of President Roosevelt's New Deal programs, deployed thousands of young men to clear debris and rebuild infrastructure. The federal government provided loans and grants to help families and businesses recover. The response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Depression-era America. Communities came together with remarkable solidarity, sharing resources and labor without regard for social distinctions. Wealthy families opened their homes to displaced neighbors. Workers donated portions of their meager wages to relief funds. Churches and synagogues organized food drives and clothing collections. But the disaster also exposed the limitations of existing systems. The Weather Bureau's failure to warn New England had been catastrophic, and the public demanded answers. Congressional hearings examined the sequence of decisions that had left millions of people unprepared. The young forecaster Charles Pierce was called to testify, and his ignored warning became a symbol of institutional failure. If you are watching this and feel moved by this story of survival and solidarity, I ask you to leave a comment saying, "Nature tests us, but humanity endures." Let those words be a tribute to everyone who survived this storm and to everyone who helped in the recovery. The aftermath of the Great Hurricane of 1938 would transform American meteorology forever. The Weather Bureau faced intense criticism for its failure to predict the storm's path and intensity. Investigations revealed systemic problems in communication, analysis, and decision-making that had allowed a major hurricane to strike a densely populated region without any warning. In response, the federal government invested heavily in improving weather forecasting capabilities. New observation stations were established along the Atlantic coast. Communication networks were upgraded to ensure that critical information could be transmitted quickly and reliably. Training programs were developed to help forecasters recognize the signs of unusual storm behavior. Most importantly, the disaster led to a fundamental change in how Americans thought about weather prediction. The 1938 hurricane demonstrated that historical patterns could not be trusted absolutely, that nature was capable of surprises that defied conventional wisdom. This recognition opened the door to new approaches in meteorology, including statistical analysis, theoretical modeling, and eventually the computer simulations that would revolutionize the field. The storm also accelerated the development of hurricane warning systems. In the years following the disaster, the Weather Bureau established dedicated hurricane forecasting offices and began issuing formal advisories for tropical systems. These improvements would save countless lives in future storms, though the 1938 hurricane remained a reminder of what could happen when warnings failed. The physical recovery of New England took years to complete. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Infrastructure that had served communities for generations had to be replaced. The famous forests of New England, which had been devastated by the storm's winds, required decades of replanting and regrowth. Some communities never fully recovered. Beach towns that had been popular summer destinations before the storm found themselves unable to attract visitors to shores still scarred by destruction. Fishing villages that had lost their fleets struggled to rebuild their maritime economies. Families that had owned property for generations were forced to sell and relocate, but in many places, the disaster became a catalyst for renewal. Communities that rebuilt often did so with improved building codes and better infrastructure. The experience of surviving the hurricane created bonds of solidarity that strengthened civic institutions, and the stories of the storm, passed down through generations, became part of the cultural identity of New England. The Great Hurricane of 1938 also changed the way Americans understood their relationship with nature. In the prosperous years of the 1920s, and even through the hardships of the Depression, many people had believed that human progress had tamed the natural world. Modern technology, scientific knowledge, and industrial power seemed to offer protection against the forces that had threatened earlier generations. The hurricane shattered that illusion. In a matter of hours, nature had demonstrated its capacity to overwhelm everything that human beings had built. The most advanced nation on Earth had been unable to predict or prevent a storm that killed hundreds and caused billions in damage. The lesson was clear and humbling. This recognition would shape American attitudes toward natural disasters for decades to come. The hurricane helped build support for federal programs in disaster preparedness and response. It contributed to the development of building codes designed to withstand extreme weather, and it fostered a new respect for the power of nature that would influence environmental thinking throughout the 20th century. The survivors of the 1938 hurricane carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many found it difficult to speak about what they had witnessed, the memories too painful to revisit. Others became dedicated to ensuring that future generations would not suffer as they had, working to improve warning systems, building codes, and emergency response procedures. Children who had lived through the storm grew up with a heightened awareness of weather and its dangers. They taught their own children to respect the power of nature, to pay attention to forecasts, to prepare for emergencies. The hurricane became a defining event in family histories, a story told and retold at holiday gatherings and reunions. In the decades following the disaster, New England experienced other hurricanes, though none matched the intensity and devastation of the 1938 storm. Each time tropical weather threatened the region, memories of that September day resurfaced, reminding residents of what could happen when nature unleashed its full fury. The Great Hurricane of 1938 also found its place in literature, art, and popular culture. Writers captured the drama and tragedy of the storm in novels and short stories. Photographers documented the destruction and recovery. Filmmakers explored the human dimensions of the disaster. The hurricane became part of the American narrative, a story of loss and resilience that resonated with audiences far beyond New England. Katharine Hepburn, one of the most famous actresses of her generation, was in her family's home in Connecticut when the hurricane struck. The storm destroyed the house, sweeping away possessions and memories that could never be replaced. Hepburn survived by clinging to debris, eventually making her way to safety through chest-deep water. She would later describe the experience as one of the most terrifying of her life. The hurricane's impact on the insurance industry was profound and lasting. Many of the major insurance companies were headquartered in Hartford, and the storm represented the largest natural disaster claim in American history up to that point. The industry was forced to reconsider its risk models, its reserve requirements, and its approach to catastrophic events. These changes would have far-reaching consequences for homeowners, businesses, and communities across the country. Insurance premiums reflected new understandings of hurricane risk. Building requirements incorporated lessons learned from the 1938 disaster. The relationship between insurance and disaster preparedness became more explicit and more important. The Great Hurricane of 1938 marked the end of an era in American history. It was the last major hurricane to strike the United States before World War II, and the country that emerged from the war would be vastly different from the one that had experienced the storm. New technologies, new institutions, and new ways of thinking would transform American society in ways that the hurricane survivors could scarcely have imagined. But the lessons of the 1938 hurricane remained relevant. As climate change began to alter weather patterns in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scientists and policymakers looked back at the storm as an example of what could happen when extreme weather struck unprepared communities. The hurricane became a case study in the importance of warning systems, emergency preparedness, and resilient infrastructure. The story of the 1938 hurricane is ultimately a story about human beings facing forces beyond their control. It is a story of tragedy, of lives cut short and communities destroyed. But it is also a story of courage, of ordinary people finding extraordinary strength in the face of disaster. It is a story of solidarity, of neighbors helping neighbors, of strangers becoming family in shared adversity. And it is a story of resilience, of communities rebuilding and individuals carrying on despite everything they had lost. The morning after the storm, September 22, 1938, dawned clear and quiet over New England. The hurricane had moved on, leaving behind a landscape of devastation that stretched from Long Island to the Canadian border. Survivors emerged from shelters to find a world transformed. Trees that had stood for centuries lay across roads. Houses that had sheltered generations had vanished. The familiar landmarks of communities had been erased, replaced by debris and destruction. But in that devastation, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors called out to each other, checking on the welfare of families they had known for years. Strangers offered help without being asked. People who had lost everything found the strength to comfort those who had lost even more. In the midst of tragedy, the best qualities of human nature emerged. Thomas Murphy was a firefighter in Providence who worked without rest for 3 days following the storm. He waded through floodwaters to rescue families trapped in their homes. He pulled bodies from the debris and carried them to makeshift morgues. He held the hands of survivors as they learned that their loved ones had not made it. And when his own home was found destroyed, his own family safe but homeless, he continued working, knowing that others needed him more. Years later, when asked why he had pushed himself so hard, Thomas gave a simple answer. That is what we do. When trouble comes, we help each other. That is what makes us human. The recovery from the Great Hurricane of 1938 was slow and difficult. Federal assistance, though significant by the standards of the time, could not begin to address the scale of the devastation. Many families had no insurance, no savings, and no resources beyond their own labor. They rebuilt their lives through sheer determination, working multiple jobs, accepting help from churches and charities, and never giving up hope that tomorrow would be better than today. The Works Progress Administration, another of Roosevelt's New Deal programs, employed thousands of workers in hurricane recovery projects. They cleared debris, rebuilt roads, repaired bridges, and restored the infrastructure that communities needed to function. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but it provided both income and purpose to people who desperately needed both. Communities organized themselves for recovery with remarkable efficiency. Local leaders coordinated relief efforts, ensuring that assistance reached those who needed it most. Churches became centers of community life, providing not only spiritual comfort, but also practical support in the form of food, clothing, and shelter. Schools reopened as quickly as possible, giving children a sense of normalcy and giving parents the freedom to focus on rebuilding. The recovery also revealed the deep divisions in American society. Wealthy families who had lost beach houses received more attention and assistance than working-class families who had lost everything they owned. Communities with political connections received federal support more quickly than those without. The hurricane had struck everyone equally, but the recovery was anything but equal. These disparities sparked conversations about fairness, about responsibility, and about the role of government in helping citizens recover from disasters. The 1938 hurricane contributed to a broader national discussion about social safety nets, about the obligations of the prosperous to the less fortunate, and about the meaning of community in modern America. In the years following the storm, New England gradually healed. Homes were rebuilt, businesses reopened, forests regrew. The physical scars of the hurricane faded, though they never entirely disappeared. Foundations of destroyed buildings could still be found decades later. Silent monuments to the storm's power. The human scars healed more slowly. Survivors carried their memories with them, the sounds and smells and images of that terrible day never quite fading. Some found comfort in sharing their stories, connecting with others who had experienced the same trauma. Others kept their memories private, too painful to revisit even years later. The children of 1938 grew up and had children of their own. They passed down the stories their parents had told them, keeping alive the memory of the hurricane and the lessons it taught. By the end of the 20th century, almost everyone who had lived through the storm had passed away, but their stories remained, preserved in books and archives and family traditions. The Great Hurricane of 1938 stands as one of the most significant natural disasters in American history. It killed more people than any other hurricane to strike the northeastern United States. It caused more damage, in inflation-adjusted terms, than almost any storm before or since. And it transformed the way America understood and prepared for hurricanes, changes that have saved countless lives in the decades since. But beyond the statistics and the policy changes, the 1938 hurricane remains important as a human story. It is a story about the fragility of life and the persistence of hope. It is a story about the limits of human knowledge and the importance of humility in the face of nature. And it is a story about the bonds that connect us to each other, bonds that are tested in times of crisis and strengthened through shared adversity. The survivors of the 1938 hurricane did not choose to be heroes. They were ordinary people, facing extraordinary circumstances. They were parents trying to protect their children. They were neighbors trying to help their friends. They were strangers who became brothers and sisters in the shared experience of survival. Their heroism lay not in grand gestures, but in simple acts of courage, compassion, and determination. The Great Hurricane of 1938 devastated New England and changed America's climate future forever. It revealed the power of nature and the limitations of human knowledge. It exposed the weaknesses in systems designed to protect people from disasters. And it demonstrated in the most powerful way possible the importance of preparation, warning, and community solidarity. But most of all, the hurricane showed what human beings are capable of when everything they know is swept away. In the face of destruction, they found courage. In the midst of loss, they found compassion. In the aftermath of tragedy, they found the strength to rebuild. They did not give up, they did not surrender, they endured, and they passed that legacy of endurance on to us. Every time we prepare for a hurricane, every time we heed a warning, every time we help a neighbor in distress, we honor the memory of those who lived through the Great Hurricane of 1938. We carry forward the lessons they learned at such tremendous cost. And we affirm the fundamental truth that the storm revealed, that human beings, when they stand together, can survive anything that nature brings. The people of New England in 1938 had no warning of what was coming. They had no time to prepare, no chance to evacuate, no opportunity to say goodbye. They faced the storm with nothing but their courage and their faith in each other, and they survived. Today we have warning systems that can track hurricanes days in advance. We have building codes designed to withstand extreme weather. We have emergency response systems that can mobilize within hours of a disaster. We have all of this because of what happened on September 21st, 1938. The lessons of that terrible day are built into the institutions that protect us, but technology alone cannot save us. Warning systems are only useful if people listen to them. Building codes are only effective if they are enforced. Emergency response systems are only helpful if communities are organized to use them. The true legacy of the 1938 hurricane is not the technology it inspired, but the understanding it created. The recognition that we are all vulnerable, that we all need each other, that survival depends on solidarity. September 21st, 1938 began as an ordinary Wednesday in New England. By the time it ended, nothing was ordinary anymore. The great hurricane had transformed the landscape, the institutions, and the people of an entire region. It had taken everything from some and spared others by the narrowest of margins. It had revealed the worst of nature and the best of humanity. The sun set that evening on a scene of devastation beyond anything New England had ever experienced. But it would rise the next morning on something else, on communities beginning the long work of recovery, on neighbors helping neighbors, on strangers becoming friends, on the first tentative steps toward rebuilding and renewal. The storm is gone now, 87 years in the past. Most of the buildings it destroyed have been replaced. Most of the trees it toppled have been succeeded by new growth. Most of the people who lived through it have joined their ancestors in the ground. But the memory remains, the lessons remain, the story remains, and as long as that story is told, the people who lived through the great hurricane of 1938 will never truly be gone. They live on in the warning systems that protect us from storms. They live on in the building codes that make our homes safer. They live on in the emergency response procedures that save lives every year. They live on in the simple human truth that was proven on that terrible Wednesday in September, that when disaster strikes, we survive by helping each other. That is the legacy of the great hurricane of 1938. That is the lesson it taught. And that is the story that must never be forgotten. The Connecticut River still flows through the valley it has carved over thousands of years. The beaches of Long Island still welcome visitors every summer. The streets of Providence still bustle with the energy of a thriving city. Life has returned to normal in New England, or at least to what passes for normal in the modern world. But beneath the surface of that normalcy, the memory of the hurricane endures. Old-timers still speak of the storm with a mixture of awe and grief. Historic markers commemorate the places where tragedy struck. Museums preserve the artifacts and photographs and oral histories that keep the past alive. And every September, as hurricane season reaches its peak, meteorologists remember the storm that changed everything. The 1938 hurricane taught America that nature cannot be predicted with certainty, that the past is not always a reliable guide to the future, that catastrophe can strike without warning. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were nearly 9 decades ago. Climate change is making extreme weather more frequent and more intense. The population of coastal areas continues to grow, placing more people in harm's way. The need for preparedness, for warning systems, for community resilience has never been greater. The survivors of the 1938 hurricane would recognize our challenges. They faced a world of uncertainty and danger, and they found ways to protect themselves and each other. They did not have the technology we have today, but they had something more important. They had community, they had solidarity. They had the understanding that survival is a collective endeavor, that no one faces disaster alone. We honor their memory by carrying forward what they taught us. We honor their sacrifice by learning from their experience. We honor their courage by facing our own challenges with the same determination they showed. The great hurricane of 1938 devastated New England and changed America's climate future forever. But it also revealed something about human nature that no storm can destroy: our capacity to endure, to rebuild, and to hope. The winds have long since died away. The floodwaters have long since receded. The dead have long since been laid to rest. But the story continues. It continues in the institutions we have built to protect ourselves. It continues in the communities we have created to support each other. It continues in the simple human acts of kindness and courage that echo the actions of those who survived that terrible day. The Great Hurricane of 1938 is history now, but history is not dead. It lives in us, in the choices we make, in the values we hold, in the stories we tell. And as long as we remember what happened on September 23, 1938, as long as we honor the lessons it taught, as long as we carry forward the legacy of those who survived, the hurricane will never truly be over. It will continue to shape our future, just as it shaped our past. It will continue to remind us of what we are capable of, both in terms of vulnerability and in terms of strength. It will continue to call us to be better prepared, more compassionate and more united. And it will continue to tell its story, through us, to generations yet unborn. This is the story of the Great Hurricane of 1938, the storm that came without warning, the catastrophe that no one predicted, and the tragedy that transformed a nation. But it is also the story of the people who lived through it, the families who lost everything and found the strength to start again, the communities that were destroyed and rebuilt themselves stronger than before, the individuals who faced the worst that nature could offer and discovered the best in themselves and each other. It is a story of destruction and renewal, of loss and recovery, of despair and hope. It is a story that belongs to all of us because we are all the inheritors of what those survivors learned. We live in the world they helped create, protected by the systems they inspired, guided by the lessons they taught, and now the story is told. The hurricane has been remembered. The dead have been honored. The survivors have been celebrated. The lessons have been shared. If you watch this far, it is because this story touched something in you. Perhaps it reminded you of your own experiences with nature's power. Perhaps it made you think about the communities you belong to and the people you would help in a crisis. Perhaps it simply moved you as a human story of courage and resilience. Whatever brought you here, whatever kept you watching, I want to thank you. Your attention is the greatest tribute to those who lived through the Great Hurricane of 1938. Your interest in their story keeps their memory alive. Your engagement with this content ensures that the lessons of that terrible day will never be forgotten. If you watch this far, please leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your comment means more than you might realize. It tells me that these stories matter, that history still has the power to move us, that the experiences of those who came before us still resonate with those of us living today. If this story moved you, please give it a like. That simple gesture helps this content reach more people, spreading the lessons of the 1938 hurricane to a wider audience. Every like is a vote for stories that matter, for history that teaches, for content that connects us to our shared human heritage. And if you know someone who would appreciate this story, please share it with them. Perhaps they have family connections to New England. Perhaps they are interested in weather and climate. Perhaps they simply appreciate a well-told story of human endurance. Whatever their reason, sharing helps build a community of people who care about history and about each other. Finally, if you have not already subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so now. This is a place where history comes alive, where forgotten stories are remembered, where the experiences of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances are honored and preserved. By subscribing, you join a community dedicated to learning from the past and applying those lessons to the future. The Great Hurricane of 1938 devastated New England and changed America's climate future forever. But it also demonstrated something that no amount of devastation can diminish: the human capacity for courage, compassion, and community. That is the true legacy of the storm, and that is what we carry forward together into whatever future awaits. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and thank you for being part of this community of stories and shared humanity. The wind still blows across New England, as it has for millions of years. The ocean still rises and falls with the tides. The weather still changes, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. Nature continues its eternal cycles, indifferent to human hopes and fears. But we are not indifferent. We remember what happened on September 21, 1938. We honor those who were lost and those who survived. We learn from their experience and apply those lessons to our own lives, and we carry forward their legacy of courage and community into a future that they could never have imagined. The Great Hurricane of 1938 is part of our history now, but more than that, it is part of who we are. It is woven into the fabric of American society, into the institutions that protect us, into the values that guide us, into the stories that inspire us. It will always be with us, a reminder of what we have faced and what we have overcome, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. And so the story ends where it began, with the ordinary moments of life that precede the extraordinary events of history. Somewhere in New England today, children are walking to school, workers are beginning their shifts, families are sharing meals together. They do not know what tomorrow will bring. None of us do. But we know that whatever comes, we will face it together. We know that in times of crisis, we will find the courage to help each other. We know that after every storm, there is rebuilding, and after every tragedy, there is hope. That is what the survivors of the 1938 hurricane taught us, and that is the legacy we carry forward. The storm is over. The story continues forever.